A very warm welcome to everyone this morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you're signing on from. It's a pleasure to be speaking with all of you as part of this year's Financial Inclusion Week. I'm Pranav from 60 Decibels, and I have the pleasure and privilege of this conversation with Ben from the Impact and Risk team from Incofin. I just wanted to give you a quick run through of how we're going to be spending the next 30 minutes, and then we'll dive right in. I'll begin with a quick introduction to 60 Decibels' Microfinance Index, an annual initiative to help impact investors and financial service providers to listen better to the communities that they serve. I'll also briefly introduce Ben and his background, and then we'll really dive in after Ben's introduction of Incofin's work into really getting into the nitty-gritty of how an impact-focused investor like Incofin really thinks about end client impact data and using that to improve, firstly understand, but then grow and improve their impact over time. Before I dive into that, just one important request to all of those of you who are joining us from around the world. Please don't hesitate to jump in with questions and comments in the live discussion chat box that you see. We're going to try to leave about 5 to 6 minutes towards the end of the 30 minutes to dive into your questions. And so please feel free to jump in with any comments that we can then take along the way to bring in and make this discussion even more relevant and engaging for you. So with that, I'm going to quickly share my screen. Actually, just before I do that, wanted to mention that I'm from 60 Decibels, is financial inclusion side of work. Really focus on helping our clients measure the impact they're having on communities in financial inclusion, and have been working to grow the index and make it super valuable to the community over the last few years. Ben comes from, is right now on the Impact and Risk team at Incofin, but has a tremendous amount of experience also on the investment management side, and prior to that, in the research in the financial inclusion space side. And so we'll be bringing all of those perspectives into the conversation. Ben, in case you want to just say hello.
Yes, hi everyone. As Pranav said, my name is Ben Wallingford, part of the Risk, ESG, and Impact team at Incofin Investment Management. And really happy to be part of the conversation today.
Fantastic. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And Ben, you can tell me if you can see it.
It's there. Yep.
Fantastic. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes introducing the Microfinance Index. It's really, a celebration of listening directly to the customers, the communities, and the end clients that microfinance institutions and financial service providers around the world seek to serve. It's an initiative we've been running now for 3 years. We're entering our fourth, as we move into 2025. But really, it began in 2022, where we first, in a very systematic and standardized manner, listened to close to 18,000 borrowers from across 72 microfinance institutions, or financial service providers, as we now call them. We grew that to be about 115 financial service providers and over 50,000 borrower voices in totality last year. And this year, the cumulative voices we've listened to is over 88,000, which is super exciting. These represent voices from across 46 plus countries around the world, in 80 plus local languages in which we're collecting this data. And our goal really is to expand this to the the 100K plus voices number next year. Before we dive in, and we'll be hearing a lot from Ben about the ways in which Incofin is using this data, but I just wanted to give you a snapshot for those of you who aren't familiar with the index of the type of data we're typically collecting. So as you can see on your screen, we collect data around a number of impact dimensions, such as access to financial services and financial inclusion, in this case, a microfinance loan, the impact that loan has on the businesses and the households of the communities who are receiving them. There's also important questions around client protection, and it's a theme we're going to be touching upon today in terms of the potential risks that are important to keep in mind and mitigate in the financial inclusion space, especially when serving historically underserved customers and communities. And then additional impact dimensions around resilience. So not just the short-term impact of microfinance, but the extent to which there's an increase or change in the long-term resilience to financial shocks. And last but not least, themes around agency and things around decision-making, ability and autonomy, and the ability to work towards financial goals. The last thing I'll sort of just leave you with before I dive in is just a very quick glimpse of the range of different sort of partners we work with to make this work possible. As you'll notice, it's a combination of foundations, impact investors, development finance institutions, international nonprofits, and more. So a number of organizations who choose to and prioritize listening to the communities that their portfolios and their country organizations serve. And as you can see, of course, we'll be speaking to one of them today, who's Incofin. So with that, and without sort of any further ado, I'd love to now dive into the core of today's conversation. Ben, if you'd like to introduce us to the work of Incofin to start with, and then I can ask you the first few questions I have prepared.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Pranav. Yeah, so Incofin is an impact investor who has operated for over 30 years and manages over 10 different funds, investing with a focus on three main sectors, which are financial inclusion, sustainable agriculture, and access to clean drinking water. We provide both debt, equity, as well as technical assistance to our investees with over $1 billion USD in assets under management globally. And at Incofin, at the end of the day, we invest for impact, as each of Incofin's investments aims to achieve not only a financial return, but ESG and impact returns as well. And we've been partnering with 60 Decibels as part of the MFI Index, which resulted in collecting end client level outcomes data for several of our investees in different regions, including both MFIs and agricultural companies. So yeah, looking forward to our conversation today, and thanks everyone for joining the session.
Amazing, fantastic, Ben. I think you mentioned right up front that you invest for impact, and one of the questions I'm always curious about is, impact is a broad word. It has many references, many contexts, many meanings, and different organizations think different things when they think impact. So my first biggest picture question for you is, what does impact mean at Incofin?
Well, we defined our mission to summarize our approach to impact. And our mission is that we invest for impact to drive inclusive progress and sustainable transitions. So this means not only investing responsibly, but also investing with a real purpose and for positive outcomes, whether it be from a social point of view or environmental point of view. And breaking the mission down, inclusive progress is about not growth for growth's sake alone, but inclusive progress in many forms, whether it's about improvements in the livelihoods of our end clients or about affording equal opportunities between women and men, for example. And then sustainable transitions, it's about our investees and their clients operating within the limits of our planet and transitioning through mitigation, also adaptation for improved resilience against climate change. And we do, as part of our impact management system, we follow the ABC of impact structure for our overall impact framework, which is about sustainability, risk management on the one side, mainly about avoiding harm, and impact performance management on the other side, about benefiting stakeholders, whether the stakeholders are our investees or the end clients or local communities.
Fantastic. So if I was to summarize that, it's sort of moving a little bit beyond sort of or away from sort of growth for growth's sake, like you say, but inclusive progress and thinking about how to actually make measurable progress towards sort of that broader goal. So super, super helpful. And sort of that's the sort of, I guess, the biggest picture mission that you have and sort of working towards that. I guess sort of just taking us to the micro for a second, right? Our work at 60 Decibels and our work in partnership with Incofin is really about helping you get a ground up perspective about the impact you're having, the positive impact, but also potentially the negative risks that need to be mitigated. And so my second question, sort of to bring us to that level, is how has listening to the communities that you serve helped you understand, firstly, and secondly, move towards growing the impact towards these goals the way you define them?
Yeah. Well, we need to hear from the end clients from the start of our funds and also throughout the lifetime of our funds. We start with an impact hypothesis, which is about the end client at its heart. Now, this is built into the funds from day one with formalized theory of change.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really vital to have a reality check on, is the hypothesis that we built on the theory of change functioning as we had theoretically modeled originally? And yeah, to know that, you need to hear from the end clients on what's actually happening and on what impacts that they are experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's also important to note that things change so rapidly. For example, changes in the economic or macro political environments of the countries that we operate in, that the client's experience needs to not only be checked, but regularly checked over time, to see if maybe we're addressing something that is not really an issue anymore, or the problem could be bigger than we envisioned or different than we initially thought, which could then require a revised strategy.
Really, really interesting. I guess one of the questions that comes to my mind based on what you just described is, obviously, I'm just curious, I guess, if you have any examples or instances where, either in our work together or more broadly, hearing directly from communities has helped understand things at any of those levels. Because I think the way you described it is really interesting, which is there's macroeconomic trends which you would want to have a pulse on. Second, there's institution-specific trends or challenges with their customers you might want to have a pulse on. And then certain things that might either be unexpected, sort of, I don't know, things about the hypothesis you had, which you were investing with, which maybe the assumptions are no longer true and require a revisiting of the investment strategy or what you focus on. So I'm very curious if you could just share any nuggets, even as big or small, about how data is informing or listening to communities is informing your work.
Yeah, a very good question. Yeah, I think it's worthwhile to discuss the results of the surveys with each investee and discuss about how to interpret and use the results. Based on the findings, we found it useful in some cases to define an action plan to follow up on some identified improvement areas, or even just simply, question marks to we need to learn more about. For example, there's an investee in Kenya who had two results that I'd like to highlight as an example. Sure. One is around client protection, where the survey showed that 64% of clients are understanding the interest rate and the fees that they're paying for the loan, which of course this should really be 100%. And that means that 1/3 of clients may not have a transparent understanding, despite the company having policies in place to ensure that. So the investee is following up with their clients and branch offices to understand better how this could be the case and to correct any deficiencies found in the implementation of their operating procedures for that. And another finding on an impact-related question, that on the question about whether the end client has seen an increase in their income as a result of the loan, and to which extent. 40% of men were saying, yes, it's had a significant impact, whereas only 30% of women said the same. And so particularly interesting, given the investee has loan products which are dedicated to women's unique financial needs. So that was a bit of an unexpected finding, and we're now looking into that to understand how the products can be further improved and better support women clients' progress in particular.
Super, super interesting. And I'm just wanted to sort of quickly pause to say I'm really excited by the questions coming in the chat, and rest assured I've seen them and we're going to come to them in a few minutes. I just wanted to sort of pause on both of those examples and do a bit of a double click there, Ben, because they're so interesting. You kind of sort of, perfect segue to my next question, a little bit around sort of the listening to communities from the perspective of understanding whether you're making measurable progress towards a positive impact goal, but also trying to understand potential risks that might prevent the achievement of those goals that need to be mitigated and managed over time, right? So the example you give about understanding the interest rate and the demonstration that, close to 1/3 of the respondents might not understand fully or to the extent that is required their interest rate and their terms. I guess the step back question for me a little bit is, the first thing, we would want to always encourage, and I'm curious as an investor and someone who has an influence on the financial service provider, how you foster a culture of reflection, learning, and improvement rather than the understandable concern that might come of highlighting something, especially with being in a position of sort of influence and power, being a capital allocator to these institutions. Like, how do you foster that sense of partnership so that it's about listening and focused on improvement rather than proving and being defensive about something that might not be working as planned?
Yeah, you said it very well in your question itself. It starts with how the company is introduced to the exercise, to align together on the purpose of the exercise. That this isn't a rating of the company, but the point is rather to learn more from your end clients about the potential impacts, and yes, to identify potential areas of improvement as well in the impact strategies, practices, or product offering. And yeah, I would say, as from investor perspective, that we also see it as a signal of transparency that the partner is undergoing, any type of third-party independent impact assessment or impact measurement to begin with.
That's fantastic, and I just want to sort of just sort of, I guess, emphasize that again, Ben, because this isn't the first time I've heard from an impact investor like yourself that the data from listening is almost as important as the initiative to listen itself, because it demonstrates a willingness to put oneself out there and understand, at a very fundamental level, what's working and what's not, and having sort of, you're just, I guess, having others look under the hood a little bit and work with you to sort of understand and improve impact. So I think that's a fantastic point around not just being focused on the data and the results, but rather taking a step back to appreciate and commend the commitment to listening to communities and then finding ways to incorporate those feedback loops into how the organization is run. So super, super helpful. And then flipping over to the other side, which is when you talked about the difference in, or the unexpected difference in the impact on income, where it was higher for men than for women, unlike, despite the fact that there was a women-focused or a female-focused sort of product that was designed. I know this is a pretty challenging question, so I understand you may not have the perfect answer, but I'm curious, how have you seen that work well, either in this case or others, where, it's one thing to understand something's not working as planned, and it's a very different thing to propose actionable ways to improve that. So I'm curious, either as ideas to ways in which the data could be more valuable, or the way that the organization can be very switched on to take insights and turn them into improved products that will actually see an increase, the expected increase in income for women like it is for men.
Yeah. Well, I think it's quite useful in the reports that we found, some breakdowns of each of the various questions, whether it's the client protection or the impact ones, breaking down between looking at women versus men and other segmentations of the data. And that's probably something to consider, continuing to make more robust about looking at the data in a cross-sectional way based on various client characteristics. And of course, it's also the kind of thing where the benchmarking in the reports, will continue to, have the benchmarks become more and more robust as more institutions in all the various regions and countries, reach that critical mass for benchmarks to be meaningful. Mm-hmm.
Got it. So the disaggregation of data by, say, gender and other means is important. Alongside that, more meaningful benchmarks to understand sort of where sort of performance is really great versus where there's room for improvement. And again, I realize we're using certain perhaps jargony words, but just for everyone's knowledge, what Ben is referring to with regards to benchmarks is, the dimensions of impact that I showed you translate to very specific survey questions. And what's fantastic is, or what we're very excited about at 60 Decibels, is that all of the borrowers that we're listening to get the exact same question, of course, in different local languages. And what that enables us to do is actually benchmark the impact performance of financial service providers against other organizations in the same country, in the same region, and globally. And so, Ben, to your point, if I make sure I get that right, is the more localization and the higher concentration of benchmarked companies we have within the same country, within the same subparts of large countries, the more actionable the data will be, because there'll be a much more hyper-local level of comparability. And so that's definitely something that we're actively working towards. It doesn't happen easily, because it's a movement we're trying to build around listening and getting people actively participating. But very well noted, and something that we see making a lot of sense as well. I realize we have about sort of 10 minutes to go. And so my last question for you before we move to the Q&A, because there's many questions in there, Ben, is what are some, maybe not one, but what are some tips that you might have for other impact-focused investors or foundations who are interested and keen to measure impact, or listen to their communities and thereby measure impact, but I find it very complex or challenging or messy? Curious to hear if you had any tips for them.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it's worth it to gather direct feedback from end clients on the impacts that they're experiencing, supporting to make adjustments as needed. It's also, I think, important to work with a service provider that has the skill set of standardized, unbiased, independent questioning in the client survey.
Mm-hmm.
I think also we would suggest it's to discuss and interpret the results together with the investee is important, to define an investee specific action plan based on the findings, and to help the investee interpret the findings in line with their own impact management system, impact management strategy, and the overall mission that the company has.
Amazing. So just going to repeat that back. So it's about sort of really emphasizing the value of listening to the end community, number one. Number two, sort of selecting the right provider from collecting sort of independent, unbiased sort of questioning and sort of collecting of data from communities. And last but not least, really getting into the data and the details with the participating financial service provider, right? And I just want to emphasize that one, because it's when you do that in partnership when they really begin to see sort of the immense value of the data, and coming from a place of learning rather than sort of evaluation, which can be quite challenging. So thanks a ton for all of those insights and perspectives, Ben. I'm going to sort of just look through these questions, and I'm going to pass one to you and have you think about it for a few minutes as I answer a couple that's focused on methodology. So one of the questions, Ben, that I'd maybe love for you to think about is, how you think about moving sort of, or like focusing on what I understand, and this is the question from Kashif. Thanks, Kashif, for that question, firstly, which is around how do you think about moving those communities and customers who are, in some sense, sort of, I think this is like NPL being the non-performing loans. Like, how do you think about those kinds of customers who might be distressed, and sort of how do you think about moving them up? But, Ben, that's something I'd love to understand from you because you're investing both for, purpose, but also profit. So I imagine that's a tough sort of challenge to thread, but I'll sort of leave you with that for a few minutes. And then a couple of very quick questions I'll respond on the methodology. One is, Alfonso, thank you for your question about the representativeness of how much of the data is Incofin investment representing. So, just to take a step back, there are, like I said, 127 financial service providers included in the 2024 edition of the index. There are many companies. It's kind of hard for the top of my head to think about how many of those are sort of within the Incofin portfolio, but definitely, 1,000+ respondents, I would imagine, if not much more, are respondents who are from sort of financial service providers that Incofin is invested in. So that's just a very quick response to your question. And then another question from Kashif, and then Ben, I'll maybe hand to you to think about the profit versus purpose element is, in terms of the, I'm not actually sure, unfortunately, what he means by Kashif by VOC method. So if you could just clarify that, that would be great. I'm sorry, I don't know that acronym, but in terms of how we go ahead, sort of how we collect the data, all of our data for the Microfinance Index is collected via local language phone interviews. We have in-country enumerators and researchers in about 90+ countries around the world, last I checked, who actually pick up the phone and conduct these interviews in a conversational manner. But what is really interesting is we're also experimenting with a range of other data collection techniques like SMS, IVR, WhatsApp-based interviews. We're also exploring other sort of emerging technologies for more sort of seamless interviews in, say, more sort of high data or digital sort of contexts. But yeah, those are some ways in which we collect data. I can share more, of course, with anyone who has questions. Ben, over to you. Talk to us about your investing and how do you navigate that?
Yeah. And if I understand well, the question that was mentioning about NPL, non-performing loans, and how to factor that in. Just a couple of thoughts that come to mind. I think it's important in client surveys like this to include in the survey clients who are in NPL, and ideally even clients who have defaulted, to get a full picture. The challenge with that is that they tend to be harder to find or to participate. But that's the only way to really get the full picture and a robust view of the overall impacts in both directions that are happening. And yeah, of course, this topic of NPL in general, it's really crucial, as keeping the NPL low is good for the institution and the client to ensure that the operations are sustainable and that the impacts can be achieved as they should.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Ben. I'm going to sort of go in no particular order to some of the other questions. I think one is, actually, I'll have you think about one of them, Ben, which is really about the question on how do you translate the data into sort of practical actions to improve the impact, right? And how do you actually ensure that these actions are reflecting the borrower needs? So I'll let you think about that on the investor side. I can suggest some ideas here, but would love for you to think about that as well. A couple of methodology questions. One I see here from Caroline. Thank you so much for your question around data sharing. It's an excellent question. It's an emerging concern in countries around the world where people want to ensure that the data and their personally identifiable information, particularly, or commonly known as PII, is secure, is protected, and it's not sort of sold unfairly or without their consent, right? And so the one thing I want to sort of just reassure is that, we are actively working with our financial service provider and investor partners across countries to sort of make it very clear how we manage the data we receive from them and to ensure that it is compliant with national and regional laws. So, as a company, we are sort of GDPR compliant, the data protection sort of and privacy law here in Europe, but that we find that it covers most of the data protection sort of requirements globally. But we do have a country-specific strategy if required in sort of communicating and really ensuring that the way we use or collect the data, the personally identifiable information, the way we use it and the way we destroy it at the end of our projects is in line with country level requirements. So that's kind of it, but I will acknowledge that it's a growing concern and one we need to be mindful of to make sure that our work is in line with sort of regulatory expectations. And then very quickly, the one other quick response before, Ben, I hand to you is around the subjectivity of the questions. And this is from Alfonso. It's a really good question, Alfonso. I think that the way we think about subjectivity is one of the things that, used to come to my mind and others is like subjectivity means, it's not comparable, or subjectivity means it's anecdotal. But one of the things that we've tried to refine our methodology to do, Alfonso, is, collect data on subjective questions at scale. In a manner that becomes sort of quantifiable and sort of comparable towards decision making. So what I mean by that is, if we're asking the exact same questions to thousands or tens of thousands of respondents, as we are in this case with the index, what that enables us to do is sort of, if we have A, data that's systematically collected, and B, that can be then benchmarked against similar organizations in the same region, our hope is that some of that subjectivity will apply across these organizations, and some of the sort of trends we're seeing in outperformance or rooms for improvement are in fact a reflection of the lived experience of communities. So that's really our goal, which is subjective data collected at scale through a combination of scale questions and qualitative questions, and then with benchmarks to actually help understand what's working and where there's room for improvement. Ben, over to you to help us think about maybe the impact and practical actions from the data. And I'll keep looking through the chat.
Yeah, and the question about transforming the data into practical actions. We're still learning ourselves on how best to use the data. I think it first starts with a conversation with the investee on some of the improvement areas, and once investigated and understood better with the end clients, never implementing a solution without feedback from the client, and then after implementing the fix, to survey clients again somewhere down the road and understand if, for example, the client protection improvement is actually being experienced by clients on the ground.
Great. Okay, fantastic. I realize we have just a minute, but we'll just sort of quickly wrap up here, which is I just wanted to sort of a couple of very quick responses. One, Ben, thanks so much for that response. Two, I just want to say that there's a question around representativeness as we design an index. It's a fantastic question. How do we ensure that the data we're collecting is representative of the borrowers, of the financial institution? And the way we do that at this stage is we request access ideally to the entire database of customer contacts. But when that's not available or possible to share with us, we receive, between sort of 3,000 to 5,000 randomly selected contacts from the financial service provider. And then we try to make sure that some of the key characteristics around gender, tenure, group versus individual lending, proportion of PAR 30 customers match the population averages to ensure that at least randomly speaking, we're speaking with segments that are in line with the population. And then once again, we randomly sample from that list to reach as representative a group as possible. So just want to emphasize that it's a work in progress. We're trying to move towards a greater and greater level of access to customer contacts. So we're speaking with a representative set, and hopefully that helps with the benchmarking. And so given that we're at time, I just want to pause here, but I just want to sort of summarize a quick couple of things, Ben, that you and I discussed. One, just the emphasis on the value of listening to end communities, both from understanding the positive impact, which I thought was a great example with the gender difference and increase in income and how to improve that, as well as the potential risks with communities. So the idea that we move towards a world where a larger and larger proportion of customers understand the loans they're getting access to, and getting data on an ongoing basis, as you say, to understand a pulse check on the customer to really make sure that trend is moving upwards, and really working, like you say, partner with the financial service provider to make sure they feel that sense of partnership and reflection so that they can work on improving rather than defending sort of performance. And again, some really, really great questions on the chat. And I know we haven't gotten to all of them. If you have any pending questions, please don't hesitate to reach out directly to either Ben or myself. We'd love to sort of have a long conversation and keep keep the conversation going. But thank you so much for joining us. And Ben, any final words before we jump off?
No, just thanks everyone for joining the session. And yeah, looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.